If it's Friday, the abortion battle rages across America as President Biden meets with blue state governors on where the fight goes from here. Inside that meeting, the president's message and how states are reacting, all in just a moment. Plus, the climate crisis, the Supreme Court delivers a blow to Biden's climate agenda, rolling back some federal powers on that issue. Why it matters and what it means for the fight against climate change in this country and in the courts. And later, Odessa's mounting death toll, new reporting from Kyiv after Russian rockets pummel residential areas in the key area of the southern part of that country. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Chuck Todd, and welcome to a post-Roe America, where the battle over abortion rights is now being contested at the state level and at the ballot box, and the battle begins in 32 days. A group of Democratic governors met virtually this afternoon with President Biden on the issue of abortion rights. Those governors urged the president to consider more action, including expanding abortion access on federal lands. And while President Biden said he would consider their suggestions, he also warned that the full impact of the court's decision has yet to be felt nationwide.
I think people are going to be shocked when the first state that tries to arrest a woman for crossing a state line to get health services, and I don't think people believe that's going to happen, but it's going to happen, and it's going to telegraph to the whole country that this is a gigantic deal that goes beyond. I mean, it affects all your basic rights.
In just a few moments, I'm going to talk to one of the governors who was in that meeting, Washington's Jay Inslee. In the wake of last week's Supreme Court ruling, abortion access has now been banned or restricted in at least 12 states. Restrictions are pending or tied up in the courts and a whole bunch more, as you can see on our screen. And we're about to see the nation's first direct ballot test on abortion since the ruling. And it's going to take place in Kansas on not the biggest election day. It's going to happen on August 2nd. Voters there are going to decide the fate of a constitutional amendment that essentially would overturn the state's abortion rights protections from its constitution, the state constitution, that is. If this passes, the right to an abortion will not exist anymore in Kansas. Now, groups on both sides of this issue have been hitting the airwaves in the state already, and they were doing it even before the official ruling from the Supreme Court.
Kansas has become an abortion destination.
Because of a radical court decision, out-of-state residents are coming to Kansas to have abortions in record numbers.
It's a government mandate that could ban all abortions with no exceptions, even rape and incest. It's dangerous, and it ties the hands of doctors in Kansas.
And just this morning, the lone Democratic member of Kansas's congressional delegation, Cerise Davids, stressed the referendum's importance.
Kansas is the free state, and we have fought long and hard to make sure that we continue to be so. And I think that making sure that our neighbors, that folks know that we're going to be the first place in the country to have voters speak on this specific issue. I cannot overstate the importance of this constitutional amendment we have on the ballot on August 2nd.
But let's be realistic here. It's an August 2nd primary, so it's worth noting the amendment, this vote in Kansas, it's going to pass. It's happening in the middle of summer on a primary election day where turnout, especially among young voters, is expected to be low. There's not a lot of competitive primary races bringing anybody to the polls, and that's probably what the drafters of the referendum wanted. By the way, August 2nd, college doesn't start for another couple of weeks, so you won't get those extra voters perhaps in Manhattan or Lawrence. Still, the margin of this vote could be telling. It should be a rout by the Republicans. But what if it's not a rout? Could be an early gauge for the political potency of this issue for Democrats in races across the board in November when you have a robust actual electorate out there. Joining me now from the White House is NBC's Josh Letterman. Also with us is Katie Bernard. She's a reporter from the Kansas City Star, has been covering the referendum and the abortion issue in general in her state. And Deborah Yetter, reporter from the Louisville Courier-Journal, who's covering the dizzying back and forth on abortion in the Kentucky courts. Again, what we're telling you, very state-oriented. But let's start with what the president did today, Josh. He brought in these governors. I think all but one of the blue state governors, a couple of them ended up no showing. I think Gretchen Whitmer was going to come, and she decided not to come. But it was notable to me to hear these governors be pressing the Biden administration to do more, and the president really sort of not quite taking accepting that invitation.
Yeah, that's right, Chuck. The Democratic governors echoing some of that frustration that we've heard, frankly, from a lot of Democratic activists and even lawmakers on Capitol Hill, that the administration hasn't gone farther in the days since that Supreme Court ruling. Now, we know the White House feels like they have gone just as far as they can go legally. They don't want to take steps such as trying to create abortion clinics on federal lands, which is another idea that has been put forward that the White House feels like is actually a terrible idea because it could open up, according to them, women to prosecution the second they step foot off of that federal land back into states where abortion is not legal. And in a way, the president was preaching to the choir today by speaking to Democratic governors in states that are already doing what the White House wants, which is moving rapidly to shore up abortion protections in their states. But the point here was that the White House really feels like the next battleground for this is the states. Now that the Supreme Court has said there's no federal constitutional right, they want people to be pressuring their state and local officials as hard as possible to be taking action to protect abortion in those various states. The president also made what I thought was a little bit of news in terms of his thinking about the federal legislative strategy going forward, acknowledging that they don't have the votes right now to carve out a filibuster exception because of Senators Manchin and Sinema, but essentially signaling that he is happy to go straight around Senators Manchin and Sinema if Democrats can simply pick up 2 Senate seats in the midterm elections and hold on to the House, which you know better than anyone, Chuck, is not something Democrats can take for granted right now.
Josh, it does seem, though, is that the administration, that there's some sort of edict that says don't do anything that might invite a lawsuit. Why are they afraid of essentially pushing the envelope and letting the institution of the judiciary work its will?
Well, I think you have to keep in mind that President Biden is not exactly someone who has been a decades-long champion of abortion rights. He is someone who's been skeptical, particularly earlier in his career, and as he has grown into a national leader for the Democratic Party, has made very clear that he now supports abortion rights and wants that codified into law. But this is an issue the president has struggled with, and frankly, I think he identifies more with some of the moderate Democrats who might personally oppose abortion but support the legal right being preserved. And so I think that may be one of the reasons that the Biden White House is hesitant to take steps, particularly that would force all federal taxpayers, all Americans, to somehow participate in the offering of abortion services when many of them may have personal views that disagree with that.
Well, Josh, I had some folks note to me that, Joe Biden's basically political career has mostly been during an era where it was the Democrats that were divided on abortion. This is really the first time he's been presiding over a time when suddenly we're in a different era and it's the Republicans that are potentially divided if you so choose to.
Well, that's right. I mean, certainly those tables have turned, and now President Biden realizes that he is going to be the president who presided over the right to abortion that had been recognized for half a century being taken away from women. And that is not something he wants to see. And yet his aides really feel like they're pretty constrained in what they can do.
Josh Letterman getting us started at the White House. Josh, thank you. Let me bring in, I want to get more on this Kansas. As we said, people want to ask this question, where is abortion on the ballot? Well, literally the first place is going to be in Kansas on August 2nd. Katie Bernard, first tell us who made the decision to put this on a low turnout primary day. Is this something the legislature was able to orchestrate? Because we all know what happens in a low turnout situation for amendments like this.
Yeah, so that was a heavy point of debate when this was put on the ballot. Obviously, when this was placed on the ballot, no one knew that Roe would be overturned by the time it happened. But the ballot initiative didn't make it through the legislature in 2020, partially because of moderate Republicans who wanted to see it placed on the November ballot. There were several switches during the 2020 elections. More conservatives got into the legislature, and it was a sticking point for many anti-abortion activists that they wanted this on the August ballot. The stated reason that they gave was that it would get it on the ballot sooner, that, they needed to be able to take this action as soon as possible. But the ultimate effect is that that is a election that Republicans turn out in more and has a far lower turnout. So it will be easier for the amendment to pass.
Do you see any evidence of sort of major campaigns now behind here? And I say this because it does seem as if this has been a little slow to get national attention at a time you would assume there would be a lot of national interest.
I actually started to see that pick up this week. We saw some evidence heading into this year of national money coming in on the abortion rights side of things. But even this week, we've seen Elizabeth Warren campaigning on the abortion rights side against the amendment. And 2 weeks ago, a massive pro-life group put in, I think, $1.3 million into campaigning on the race. So we're starting to see that churn on the money end of things, and the attention, I think, is only going to go up in the next 5 weeks.
I want to play one ad here because I'll tell you, if you listen to the ad carefully, you might not know what it's about. Take a listen.
They call it a constitutional amendment. The truth, it's a strict government mandate designed to interfere with private medical decisions, a slippery slope that could put more of your individual and personal rights at risk. The ballot language is confusing, but one thing is clear. Kansans don't want another government mandate. So on August 2nd, send a message. Say no to more government control. Vote no on changing the Constitution.
I understand they don't want to use the A word here or even reproductive rights. I get it as far as strategy is concerned, given the perception of what one might think of the Kansas electorate on this issue. But is it a bit too confusing?
I think it possibly could be, but ultimately there's enough out there about this amendment that anyone that starts digging in, anyone that's going to the polls will see very clearly in that amendment the words abortion. Ultimately, what that is clearly aimed at is Kansans with more of a libertarian streak who ultimately want government out of their health decisions, who are upset about vaccine mandates, and hopefully then on the folks who made this ad, they then hope that those folks will also see this as yet another intrusion of government into health decisions. But it does take a minute to figure out what they're talking about.
And I'm curious, is Governor Kelly, I'm sure I know where she stands on this, but is Governor Kelly, how active is she in campaigning against this amendment?
She hasn't been active at all. She, when asked by reporters when she filed to run for re-election whether she'd be engaged, she said she was focused on other issues. She was focused on her own re-election campaign and not something else that's going on. I don't expect to see her get particularly involved between now and August. She's got a really tough re-election fight ahead of her, and has pretty much left it at the statement that she supports reproductive rights. She is against abortion bans, but has not gone much further.
Well, look, this is one of those where the margin may be, when you learn more from the margin, given, like I said, the way it was sort of rigged to make sure it was a primary electorate there. Katie Bernard, really appreciate you providing some insight on this, what is going to be, I think, a monumental fight over the next month. Let me move over to Deborah Yetter from the Louisville Courier-Journal, because this is another way. This is no longer a federal issue. Every state is having a different kind of battle. What is going on with the courts here back and forth, and when should we get some resolution on the future of Kentucky's abortion law?
Well, that's not clear. Abortions resumed today in Kentucky at the two clinics that are both in Louisville. That came after a state judge issued a temporary restraining order barring our state's trigger law. We're one of 13 states with a trigger law, and one of the few where abortion access ended immediately upon on June 24th when the Roe v. Wade decision was released. So the Attorney General, who's a Republican, Daniel Cameron, has appealed the temporary restraining order, trying to get that overturned, and that's pending before the appeals court right now. But in the meantime, the clinics are operating again as usual after having to suspend services for about 6 days.
What is the specific challenge about this trigger law? What in the state constitution do proponents believe it violates?
The proponents are arguing that the Constitution, Kentucky Constitution, includes a right to privacy that would confer the right to medical decisions, including abortion. And they intend to make that case more fully next week before a state court judge. In the meantime, they have this restraining order in place. I think it's at least one of maybe a dozen states now where abortion rights advocates are making the state constitutional argument.
Is there the makeup of the state Supreme Court? What should the expectation be? Is this a court that is unpredictable, or is there an ideological lean that most people expect a decision to sort of land?
I think the people would look at the current makeup of the state Supreme Court as progressive, on the progressive side, with a few more members who skew conservative. I guess the question is what gets there first? This particular lawsuit challenging the law, or we have a ballot amendment too on the ballot on November 8th, which would end any constitutional right to abortion in Kentucky. And if that is voted on and accepted by the voters, then that would shut off that avenue.
What is going on this constitutional amendment route? What kind of organizing are you seeing on it, and is it starting to get engaged considering the environment we're in?
Well, I think Roe sort of shocked the system here, even though people were expecting it, the decision after the leaked draft of the opinion. There have been two groups getting organized. One's a coalition of sort of abortion, typical opponents of abortion, some religious groups, and the Kentucky Right to Life. They've formed an advocacy group called Say Yes to Life. On the other hand, opponents of abortion restrictions have formed a second group called Protect Access Kentucky. Both have started fundraising, but I don't think they had really ramped it up. But I think they will now that November's getting closer, and this is a real thing here in Kentucky.
Deborah, is there? Look, we know the governor, the Democratic governor, says he's pro-life, but he believes there should be some exceptions. Does this assuming the constitutional amendment didn't pass, does the state constitution not even allow for any limitations on abortion or viability, or is there been some lines drawn there?
It does. The state constitution doesn't speak to it, and so if the amendment did not pass, I think they might have a clear path forward on this claim of constitutional protection. But if it does pass and shuts off that line of pursuit, then there would not be no constitutional right in Kentucky under the state constitution. The governor, Andy Beshear, a Democrat, has called this trigger law extreme because it makes no exceptions for rape or incest or even, a severe fetal anomaly. And he has consistently said he supports the right of access under Roe v. Wade, but in a very red state, I don't know that we're going to see a lot of aggressive campaigning on that topic by him.
I imagine, especially with a re-election that would kick off in a year as well. Deborah Yetter from the Louisville Courier-Journal, really appreciate you providing some insight for us on what's going on there. And before that, Josh Letterman and Katie Bernard. We're going to get an inside look at how state leaders are trying to fight back on the abortion ruling with one of the governors who was in that meeting with the president today. Governor Jay Inslee joins me next. Plus, those explosive Supreme Court decisions. We've had dramatic hearings, January 6 subpoenas, major Fed hike, an historic gun deal, all in just the past few weeks. How much more will America handle? What's next? You're watching Meet the Press Now.
For now, it's up to the states to determine whether women can get reproductive health care.
The rights of millions of women across this country are now falling on the shoulders of just a handful of states. Just a handful of states are now going to have to take care of the health care of women from other states.
We are, in fact, that brick wall against this horrific Supreme Court decision.
Welcome back. Those are three of the Democratic governors who met virtually today with President Biden earlier, talking about how it's up to the states to take the baton on abortion access now. Joining me now is another participant from that governor's meeting with President Biden. It's Washington State's Governor Jay Inslee. Governor Inslee, happy 4th, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. Happy 4th to you.
Let me start with, look, I know what all of the governors are attempting to do, and there's a lot of those governors that were in that meeting, yourself included, who have initiated some things already to deal with, whether it's folks coming from another state where it's going to be banned, et cetera. But I'm curious, what can you tell me? What did President Biden say they could do? Because it doesn't sound like we're hearing a lot.
Oh, no, I disagree with you. I think the President Biden can do some very important things, and I believe he will do some important things. And we talked about how to basically assist the states that want to be sanctuary states. So my state intends to be fully a sanctuary state. We believe we have a responsibility to our fellow citizens in other states who have Republican politicians to decide to dictate this most private right to their citizens, and we intend to be a sanctuary state to support them. So there are many things the federal government can do, and we talked about those today. Number one, I encourage the president to essentially have an executive order to prohibit federal law enforcement agencies, FBI, Homeland Security, and the like, from giving their databases or their assets to local states who try to impinge and put their tentacles into my state to prosecute individual women and try to put them in jail. He expressed an interest in that. We hope that he can jawbone with the network providers and the like to make sure that they protect the data of women, very private information, so that these platforms don't give this information to these prosecutors who want to put their citizens in jail if they do exercise abortion services in our states. And third, I think most important, we talked to him about the both efficacy, safety, and efficiency of pharmaceutical abortion. And that means basically that we can use telemedicine to appropriately prescribe these pharmaceutical products. People not even have to travel thousands of miles, and then make sure that the FDA law is respected. These are FDA-approved products, and that these states don't try to override the federal government FDA approval of these products as safe, efficient products. He expressed an interest and is looking at measures to do that as well. So there's a lot of things that the administration can do, and I believe they will. We obviously appreciate his stepping up to the plate and asking for repeal at least a portion of our filibuster rules. So we felt good about this call. I felt good that he is committed to taking some major steps here.
The telemedicine,
well, by the way, of helping us financially,
right?
Because we
I was just going to say,
these women pay for it.
The telemedicine idea is fascinating. I think we're all curious to see if that could be implemented. What do you need from the federal government? So the idea is this: if somebody in Boise, somebody in Idaho doesn't want to have to travel over state, they can get prescribed this from a doctor in Washington state via telemedicine. And you believe, what does the federal government need to do to protect that person's ability to get the proper medication?
Two things. We need the administration to issue a statement that they consider the FDA rules to preempt state rules in this regard, and that the FDA decisions will be respected, and that the federal government will take that position. And the FDA rules are in place. They do preempt states to some degree in this regard, and simply announcing that the federal government will take that position. And second, either initiate or stand by in litigation to enforce those rules against these rogue Republican politicians who want to intrude to overpower the private decisions by their constituents. And by the way, I do think it's important this. I don't want to leave this conversation by saying this. Look, what we are experiencing here is a Republican effort to impose minority decisions in a democracy where the majority should be making these decisions. The majority of Americans want gun safety, a majority want climate change, and huge majorities want to protect the right of choice, even in states, in red states. This is what the people want. So basically saying that the federal government is going to enforce that, the majority will of Americans, is the right thing to do. And the president said that he is now assessing the right measures to take to assure that these FDA-approved drugs, in fact, can be available to all Americans.
You have a compact with California and Oregon on abortion rights. What does that mean in practice?
Well, it has two important things. One, we're going to collaborate in looking at ideas. We share technology. We share political confidence that we're all going to be in this together. We share a message to American women that the West Coast is available to help them assure this right. So in part, our compact is to make sure women across America know that we stand by to protect them. And we have found we're doing this on climate change as well. So the West Coast is a beacon of advanced thought, and not even advanced thought, just protecting what we have in this country, which is the right of choice, the right to breathe clean air and not be destroyed by climate change. The West Coast has been effective in working together.
What did the president say? I know that particularly a couple other governors brought up the idea of, is there something that can be done on federal lands in states that ban abortion? Whether it's a private enterprise that works with a tribe to open up a clinic. I know that federal funds can't be used. What did the president say about that? Does he not want to pursue that strategy?
I don't know. He certainly didn't say anything dispositive. When I brought up this issue of pharmaceutical abortions, and I suggested maybe delivery could be taken by women on federal property, for instance, he said that shouldn't be necessary, right? He brought up this issue that the FDA has already ruled these are safe products for women, and the federal law already makes this available, and we got to make sure that that preempts the wrong-headed attempt of these states. He thought that was more efficient to just do direct delivery through the U.S. mails of a federal drug administration that clearly has been given the authority. And the Supreme Court isn't going to be able to get rid of this one, calling it a major decision. They clearly have authority to do this, and I think we are in good grounds to maintain that. So I think it sounded like the president was more interested in that delivery model, and I'll back him up 100%. We really appreciate his leadership on this.
Last question I'm going to get you out on a different topic. Is there any role for you or the state government to play in protecting the University of Washington and Washington State? The economies in both places could get hit hard if essentially the Pac-12 is not what it used to be, if they're not a part of the Bay. Are you worried about that financially, and is there a role for the state to play?
Well, I'm glad we have pivoted from the existential threat of climate change, which might destroy life as we know it, to college football. So I'm glad we're doing that. But there may be some role. I haven't explored it seriously. We're more focused on some of these other issues right now. And I think we should look at it through a prism of the athlete's experience, the student's experience, what's good for them. I don't think we should evaluating this about what's good about the bottom line of universities or private, even media empires, with all due respect. We should be focused on the experience of students and young people. And frankly, if I can just a moment say somewhat just tiny controversial, I think it's kind of sad that we've lost focus of what athletics are about. Athletics ought to be about people having fun and having, a good experience with their friends and adventure, rather than turning this in factories and profit centers for colleges. I think that has distorted athletics a little bit. And I'd like to get back to the way it was when my dad was a coach, where kids could play multiple sports and they weren't turned into little profit centers to look for franchise deals. I'm looking to get back to the good old days.
If I could say here. I think that's the concern a lot have. And, oh, by the way, these are state tax dollars that we're also talking about in all these places. Anyway, Governor Inslee, you are not wrong. We got a lot of problems on our hands. College football, small potatoes, no doubt. But I have a feeling your inbox is going to get a lot of stuff anyway. Thank you, sir.
I think that's true.
Yeah. Coming up.
Thank you.
Truth matters. That's what Congresswoman Liz Cheney said as she faced off against her Trump-backed primary challenger last night. We're going to have much more on what happened on that debate stage next. You're watching Meet the Press Now.
Well, I think that there's a real tragedy that's occurring. And the tragedy is that there are politicians in this country, beginning with Donald Trump, who have lied to the American people. And people have been betrayed. He consistently has said that the election was stolen when it wasn't. So I'd be interested to know whether or not my opponent, Ms. Hageman, is willing to say here tonight that the election was not stolen. She knows it wasn't stolen. I think that she can't say that it wasn't stolen because She's completely beholden to Donald Trump.
I'm the only one up here who's actually been out there campaigning in the state of Wyoming to that extent in meeting with the people. The only time that the J6 situation ever comes up is when people talk about how unfair this entire committee is. What they're talking about is the gas prices. They're talking about food prices. They're talking about the fact that they can't travel.
Welcome back. That was Liz Cheney defending her role on the January 6th committee during her Republican debate last night as she fights to keep her congressional seat. So let's talk about everything that happened this week. I got Eugene Daniels here, White House reporter for Politico, co-author of Playbook, NBC News political contributor. Also with me, Simone Sanders. She's host of Simone on MSNBC and Peacock, and a former chief spokesperson to Vice President Harris. And Sarah Fagan, a Republican strategist who served as President George W. Bush's White House political director. And she is now a Meet the Press contributor. Welcome to all of you. Sarah, you know Liz Cheney probably pretty well. Yeah. I think you guys worked on an 2004 campaign re-elect together. She was a pretty integral part of it. What do you make of the whirlwind of Liz Cheney this week, both directing Cassidy Hutchinson, the Reagan Library speech, this debate? I mean, this was a pretty important week in the rest of her political career.
Well, you have to give her great credit, which is that she is standing on what she believes is right. She is unlikely to win her re-election. She knows that, and she's not backing down. And she believes that she is serving the country, serving the party by being the person who stands up and says strongly that she does not believe the election was stolen. So she's going to go down in history 20 or 30 years from now. We'll see.
What is that history?
What is
right.
the history?
Right.
Where is the country on this matter?
Right.
And I suspect she'll probably look pretty good in the eyes of history, but she's probably not going to win re-election, unfortunately.
But I assume she runs for president, Simone.
I was just going to say that. I do think that there is a lane.
Now, maybe not to win, but maybe
right.
Right.
I think there's a lane for Liz Cheney to be. I think the thing that she is doing, because I look at this from a communications perspective, and what she is doing is she has been very clear on her message, and she is elevating this one issue. And the issue she is elevating is the threat to democracy. And that the former president of the United States, who has a grip and a hold on the Republican Party, now some people say it's not as much as a hold. I think there's a hold. I don't know. And that he is a threat to democracy, and that you need to choose the Constitution, you need to choose democracy over all else. And I think you could see her running for president, waging a campaign, saying out there in order to continue to elevate that message.
And that's what I think the campaign's about. I don't think it's about to win. I think it really is about to make sure Donald Trump he doesn't get to escape this.
Right. It's about giving an alternative to the people in the party who are still there in the Republican Party who really care about this issue. It's really interesting throughout this entire process, and especially this week, we've been hearing from Republicans who are getting more and more wary of Donald Trump winning in 2024. They're not thinking about January 6th as having a drag on Republicans.
Are you getting the same type? I've had reporters say nobody wants to talk about January 6th on the Republican side.
Right.
But they will tell you about how weak they think he is in 2024.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
Right.
It's not about 2022.
They don't want to get his ire on that. But hey, by the way, donors don't like him.
Exactly. Yeah. Donors are upset. Big wigs in the Republican Party are saying, they're kind of getting sick of, frankly, the way that someone put it to me this week, embarrassed, right? The way that he acted and the way that Cassidy Hutchinson said he acted on January 6th and before is embarrassing to a lot of people. And so Liz Cheney is going to continue to do what she's doing. She has a long game and a long view of it in history.
Sir, what's your sense of, what are you looking for to see if Trump's grip is loosening?
So I think if you summarize the events of these hearings, which aren't yet over, I agree with a lot of these candidates. I don't think this is what people are talking about back home. I think they're talking about gas prices.
They're
and
definitely
inflation.
not talking about the January 6th.
And maybe abortion, but they're not talking about this.
So they're not paying attention to it. But who is paying attention are the potential rivals to Donald Trump. And I think that, to your point, is where this is having the most impact. So people who previously thought, well, I'm going to put myself out there for a while, but really not challenge if Donald Trump gets in, are probably thinking, maybe I'll go. Maybe I'll go either way. And we'll see how this plays out over the next couple months. But I think it's bolstered anybody thinking of running because of just, to your point, it's been embarrassing. It's embarrassing to even if half of what was said is true.
Right.
That's very troubling.
Simone, let's flip from one party to the other. A lot of agita about Joe Biden and abortion, and I feel like it's almost like, for some Democrats, this is a straw. Like, really? You're not going to fight on this either? What do you say to is that a fair hit?
I don't think it's a fair hit. Look, now, Joe Biden 20 years ago, have at it, okay? The Joe Biden, though, of right now, he has been a staunch defender of a woman's right to make decisions about their own bodies. He said that he would support codifying Roe. He recently came out again for abolishing the filibuster. Now, that's something that I think, frankly, if he could not get his some of our Democratic friends, senators, on his side for Build Back Better, what makes voters or Democrats in the party or progressives think that he can twist their arm?
The cynic in me felt like he was punting. Hey, I don't have much to do. You guys have more to do. You do it.
But, I mean, he has done things. I listened to your conversation with Governor Inslee, and he talked about the FDA. That was a move that the Biden administration's FDA did in December to expand access to medication abortion pills in advance of knowing what was coming. The meetings that Vice President Harris has been having, the work that has been done in directing HHS and DOJ to ensure that women traveling across state lines their right to do that will be protected. HHS supporting the president's directive. And so he has done the things, but are people hearing about what he has done? And the reality is there's very little he can do to affect this because it is the Supreme Court and Congress has to act, and they haven't.
And there's a frustration. There is a frustration, especially with advocates who we kind of all saw this coming. Not only when Donald Trump said he was going to put people on the Supreme Court that overturned Roe v. Wade years ago, but also when they took up the case, when my colleagues, Josh Gerstein and Alex Ward, report on the draft opinion. So now you have this long runway. So you're talking to experts who are saying, okay, on the day that they announced that Roe v. Wade is gone, why are you not talking about the executive actions that you're signing today, right? That all these conversations that were happening, the conversations that Vice President Harris was having to figure out where are the places the administration can work, why are you not signing those things today? And the administration's hearing that. They're clearly hearing that. Yeah. But you are seeing a different Joe Biden on the issue as far as him attacking the Supreme Court, something that he hasn't really done before.
Sarah, I'm curious if this phenomenon that appears to have happened, and I think we're now going to end up in a sort of our old mindset of polarization. It does appear that, at least for now, abortion has leveled the playing. Maybe it's not fully leveled, that the right's fired up on the economy and all of that. The left's now got some energy on this. Well, and if it sustains, we're headed for another close, typical election that we've had the last decade.
I don't know if it's going to be a close election. I don't really buy that. I think that it has improved Democrat enthusiasm, and if Republicans were, up 15 points on the enthusiasm measure, they're up 8 or 10 points now. It's still a really large gap. I mean, if you look at the fact that the University of Michigan consumer sentiment is at 50, the lowest since the 1940s, in the inception of it. There is measure after measure. 2/3 of the country think, 3/4 of the country think we're headed in the wrong direction. Joe Biden's job approval is at 38%. There is nothing in that soup that suggests that this is going to be a close election.
Except, Simone, Joe Biden's at 33% in Georgia, in the same poll that had Raphael Warnock up 10 points. I mean, is Biden less relevant here for now?
I don't want to say that the president is irrelevant, but I do think that these elections will be largely focused on the candidates in that particular state. The governor's race is impacting the Senate race in Georgia. It's impacting state legislatures. America's policy is made in the state legislatures. Okay, that is what we are talking about. And now people are looking at the fact that governors are their last gap stop here in terms of protecting privacy rights. Contraception may be on the table. Don't even get me started on same-sex marriage. Hello, Clarence Thomas. Okay, I read the concurring opinion. So I do think that there is a motivating factor here on the ground for Democrats, that maybe the president is not the end-all, be-all factor. Now, I will say, though, Democratic candidates, they are running on Joe Biden's agenda. They are running on what got done. If you are a member, whether you are a governor or a member of or Reverend Warnock, they're running on Build Back Better. They're running on infrastructure. They're talking about that. So I do think there's a little bit there.
I think in the grand sum of the abortion debate, it nets out to Democrat enthusiasm, no doubt. But I also think, and I heard Governor Inslee as well, that Democrats run the risk of overreaching here on this issue, which is they're talking about nobody's talking about getting rid of contraception.
It's not. I mean, that's the problem. It's like
they're talking about. No candidates are talking about
getting rid of Roe, and here we are. So I really think that if
there's not a debate about getting rid of gay marriage. You know, you have one Supreme Court justice. What
about Ken Paxton? I mean, the point is that nothing stays local anymore, I think is the important thing.
Yes, but I think Democrats start to overreach because when you start talking about, protecting prescription drugs in the mail and figuring out some strategy to get abortions done on Indian reservations, it looks like abortion at all costs under, and that's not where the country is.
Right.
Sure, the country may say on its face, we don't want Roe overturned.
Right.
They don't want abortion on demand 24/7 for any reason at any time. That is not where the majority of the country is.
I agree, and no one is there, not even the Democrats.
But that's how Democrats sound.
We're going to find out in November. All right, Eugene, Simone, and Sarah, thank you. Yeah. Enjoy the 4th. Yeah. Enjoy 246, and we're hoping to get to 247, 248, 249. Up next, rescue workers are searching for survivors after Russian missiles struck a residential area in southern Ukraine overnight. It's one of the deadliest attacks on civilians since the war began in a strategic location of Ukraine. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Ukraine is reeling from yet another missile strike by Russia, this time in a coastal town near Odessa, an important strategic part of the country. Ukraine's emergency services said at least 21 people were killed when Russian missiles struck a 9-story residential building as well as a recreational center early this morning. Let me get to Ali Arouzi. He's in Kyiv with the very latest, and this seems to be one of the pieces of strategy by the Russians. They every once in a while launch these missile strikes. Kyiv got hit before, now Odessa or near Odessa. What's Ukraine going to try to do next?
Well, I mean, they're reeling from all of these terrible attacks, and all Ukraine really can do, Chuck, is sort of defend itself on the front lines. That's their only way of defending their entire country and their people. But it's very difficult to defend from these sort of attacks. This was a sleepy little coastal village about 50 miles from Odessa called Serhivka. People would go there for just a summer break. There were no military installations there. We spoke to the spokesman for the Southern Command there, and he goes, nothing military was anywhere near there. And they hit that building very badly, so badly that the building now has to be demolished. It's beyond repair, and they hit it, Chuck, with the same X-22 cruise missiles that they launched on that shopping mall the other day. And it's been a terrible week for Ukrainian civilians, Chuck. Over the last 6 days alone, Russian missiles have killed 50 civilians, and that doesn't include battlefields on the eastern front like the Donbass, Kharkiv, or Kherson, which we don't have statistics for. So it just shows how vulnerable people across this country are, which aren't in those fighting zones. And part of the thinking here is that if you speak to Ukrainians, the Russians are just trying to normalize these sort of attacks so people don't get so shocked in the West by these continued attacks on civilians. And President Zelensky also alluded to this a week ago. He said that he thought the Russians were going to step up their attacks as Ukraine gets closer to the EU, as NATO shores up its support against Russia. So not a big surprise here, but nonetheless very upsetting.
Well, and again, the West needs to be paying attention to what's going on and not lose focus on what's happening in Ukraine. Ali Arouzi, thank you. Turning now to Moscow. There's a trial, put that in quotes, against WNBA star Brittany Griner, which began today. The closed hearing lasted about 2.5 hours, during which drug charges against Griner were read out. She did not enter a plea. A U.S. Embassy official told reporters she was able to speak with Brittany Griner today in the courtroom and is doing as well as can be expected. Griner has been detained in Russia since February for allegedly carrying a vape cartridge with cannabis oil. Her arrest raised alarms that the Kremlin was trying to use her as leverage amid its war with Ukraine. It all seemed to happen right around the same time. If convicted, she would face 10 years in prison, according to Russian law. Acquittals are very rare in Russia. Brittany Griner's next hearing will be on Thursday of next week. Still ahead, what impact will the Supreme Court's decision to curb the EPA's powers have on the growing climate crisis? I'll ask an expert next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. On the last day of the term, the Supreme Court handed another blow to the Biden administration's policy plans, this time on climate. The decision will limit the ability of the EPA to make decisions on energy and carbon emissions. The court ruled that the EPA does not have the authority to direct a nationwide shift in energy production from coal to cleaner sources like solar and wind, removing what would have been a key weapon in the Biden administration's arsenal to limit greenhouse gases. Now, the White House National Climate Advisor, Gina McCarthy, told my colleague Andrea Mitchell that the ruling still leaves room for the White House to maneuver a bit on climate. They just need to, quote, think outside the box. So let's break down the impact of yesterday's decision. I'm joined by Michael Girard. He's an environmental and energy law professor at Columbia University Center for Climate Change Law. And so let's start with what now? Because in the decision, Justice Roberts essentially says, look, if Congress directly gives this authority to the EPA, then they can have it. Is that really the best next step here, or are there other ideas that you might have?
No, there are lots of things that EPA and others can still do. The court took out one tool from the toolbox, but there are a lot of existing statutory authority that EPA still has. The court did not throw out the landmark case, Massachusetts versus EPA, that said EPA can regulate greenhouse gases. That still stands. They just said one particular technique, this Clean Power Plan, is no good.
Is there something that the Biden administration should be asking Congress to do to get this authority? I mean, is this something that's just going to have to be done via the legislative branch, considering the makeup of this court?
No, ideally, we would have legislation, but nobody thinks that's really likely. Congress hasn't passed a major environmental law of any kind in more than 30 years. But using the existing law, EPA can go ahead and greatly strengthen the controls on greenhouse gas emissions from cars and trucks. They're already doing that. They can impose restrictions on conventional and toxic air pollutants coming from coal-fired power plants under their existing law. They're moving forward with new regulations on hydrofluorocarbons and on methane, which are powerful greenhouse gases. So there are quite a few things left to be done. And the states also have a great deal of power. The court did nothing to diminish the power of the states to control greenhouse gases.
When you look at the decision that the court made here, are there other areas that the Biden White House or other climate activists have been considering that maybe are cut off now? They hit this. Is there anything in the future folks have talked about that would land in this sort of zone where the courts would say no?
Well, clearly the lawyers representing the opponents of action on climate change from the coal industry and some of the red states are going to try to use the theories, the major question doctrine that the court talked about. We don't know if those attacks will be successful. They'll probably challenge the upcoming Securities and Exchange Commission regulations and others. But many of those do have a good statutory authority already. But this is going to be a fight in the courts for years to come. Just how much authority does the federal government have, all agencies, not just EPA, without additional congressional authorization?
It seems as if we already saw in the Washington Post a lot of conservative attorneys general are looking at other suits to file against the EPA or file against the federal government on issues involving energy. What do you view as most vulnerable?
I think that the going after coal-fired power plants using various techniques is going to be a knockdown, drag out. There are also some other environmental issues that are coming up. The Supreme Court in October is hearing a major case on wetlands regulation. That may be another one where the major questions doctrine comes up.
Is it possible that coal wins these legal fights, but essentially the market itself ends up marginalizing coal?
Oh, yeah, that's already happening. The coal use is dwindling away, initially because of cheap natural gas, and now increasingly cheap solar and wind, whose costs are plummeting. So coal is on the way out. The big question is, how long will it take? And do we provide the just transition? Do we help the miners and the communities they depend on so that they can move on to the next chapter?
Is the EPA going to... Are we going to have to figure out other ways to strengthen the EPA or give them more? Or at the end of the day, this is just going to be how it works. Some statutory authority, some fights in the courts, and probably don't expect Congress to help.
It's hard to expect Congress to really help unless there's some master deal that is forged. But EPA already has a lot of power. It didn't lose as much in this decision as some people are saying.
Michael Girard from Columbia University, really appreciate you coming on and sharing your expertise. Thank you all for being with us this hour. Enjoy the July 4th holiday. Celebrate America's birthday. And remember what America is really all about. We'll be back Tuesday with more Meet the Press Now. And if it's Sunday, it's Meet the Press on your local NBC station, featuring exclusive interviews with January 6th committee member Zoe Lofgren and the Health and Human Services Secretary Javier Becerra. NBC News Now coverage continues with Aaron Gilchrist sitting in for Hallie Jackson.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.